painting this picture. And they paint it to this day, right now. So many do. They paint it to an unbelieving generation. They say, you got to do this, you got to do that. And they live for a couple hours a week inside of a 4-wall building. Chuck, I love this church. It hasn't got stained glass. It hasn't got all this junk in it. I've probably been in 700 churches in the last 6, 7, 8 years. And so many of them I go in. Don't get me wrong. It's beautiful and all that. They spend all this money on all this stuff to make the building look pretty and all this expensive carpet that they all argue over and fight about with their committees. I walk in and I see a pulpit with somebody's name on it, given by. I see stained glass windows. I went to this church in Delaware. I'll never forget it. I walked in and I was just like, God, you've got to be kidding me. I walked in this church and it had windows about the length of the whole the floor to ceiling here. And every one of them had somebody's name this big in the stained glass windows that they had donated this window. And I'll never forget seeing their name huge, and then on the top up there it had Jesus wrote about that big. And a little picture of him in the stained glass. Me, as a 10, 11, 12-year-old, I'm watching people. And hear me tonight, this morning, every one of you. There are people watching you. And they're not just little kids. They're adults as well. They are watching you at work. They're watching you at home. They're watching you at the supermarket. They're watching you when you walk out the doors of this building. They're looking for the truth. This morning, God is saying to you, are you living the truth? And you may be here this morning and saying to yourself, well, what is it then? 10 years old, I started playing music and I started looking for this truth. I started searching for it in music, and I listened to the words of these songs, and they started presenting to me what I thought was truth then. I've learned this about music and media and all these different things. Our eyes and our ears are the portals to our soul and our hearts. And whatever we take in will shape and mold us into who we will become. I have learned as well the 5 people that we let closest to us as well shape and mold us into who we will become. Whoever you hang out with and spend your time with, positive or non-positive, they will help shape and mold you into who you will be and are. I've learned it, and it's true. I associated myself with this music that told me it was okay to do all kinds of stuff, to be true to thine self. At the age of 12, I started playing the guitar. I played drums up until then, but I started playing the guitar then. And I dove into this aggressive hard rock, heavy metal music, they call it. And I turned my back on the church, and I turned my back completely on God because I didn't believe that I was finding the truth in the church. And my church and my God became rock music. And at that point, I wasn't like the other little kids. I didn't want to be a fireman, a policeman, or a doctor, a lawyer. My parents owned a business. Actually, multiple businesses. They wanted me to take their place. They wanted me to be a business owner. My brother didn't want anything to do with it, so they wanted me to do it. And I tried it. I didn't want to own a business. I wanted to be a rock star. That was it. Nothing else. And I played one of these things over here for 6, 7 hours a day. For years. I practiced and I practiced. And I went and played music with whoever I could play with. I didn't care how old they were or how young they were. Most of the guys I ended up associating with were all 2 and 3 times my age. And because of that fact, those 5 people I let closest to me, I started trying to emulate and be what they were. At the age of 17 years old, I got my very wish in a lot of ways. I played my first 20,000 seater arena at the age of 17. A little later after that, I started playing music and traveling and doing it for a living. That's all I did. I got my wish. I lived that lifestyle. But what came along with all of that was a lot of problems that I'm paying for up to this day. Last night I almost fell off of a stage. Speaking, I was at a tent revival last night. I got so dizzy and so stumbling around last night because of my blood sugar plummeting that I almost fell off the stage. Because of the things I put myself through years ago. I used to do heroin, cocaine, crystal meth, marijuana. For 13 years, I smoked 3 to 5 packs of cigarettes a day. I drank like a fish. I didn't drink water. I drank Jack Daniels like it was water. I would consume anywhere from 1/5 of that stuff a day. Usually chase that with a 12-pack to a case of beer. If I was drinking wine, I wouldn't drink 1 bottle of wine. I would drink 5 or 6. I did everything to the excess. And I searched for truth in it. These things these hallucinogenic drugs I would take. I would look for truth in these things. Some of you in here today, you've looked for truth, even in some of these things that I'm speaking about. There's people in this room right here and right now this morning. God knows who you are, and you know who you are. You have fooled some of this very stuff that I'm talking about. You know who you are. Hear me this morning, you're not going to find truth there. You're not going to find peace. I've watched people die from these very things. I lost a lot of friends to all those things because they tried to be true to themselves with it by doing those. And I can promise you right now, for some of them, I don't know what happened with them. But I know this, that every one of us are appointed a time to be born, and we're appointed a time to die. And I know that all of those people I just mentioned stood before a holy God. And whether they believed in Him or not, they bowed before Him. And they heard one of 2 things. Depart from me, for I never knew you. Or they heard, well done, my faithful servant. It was one or the other, it was not anything else. It wasn't, well, you did okay, so I'll let you in. It wasn't that. I lived my life like that for all those years. I got to the point where I didn't even want to live anymore. I tried to take my life with drugs and alcohol. I've overdosed. I've had alcohol poisoning I don't know how many times. I've entertained the idea of taking my life. I tried to with those things. Couldn't do it. Wasn't enough drugs and alcohol. Didn't work. And I was a wreck. And I didn't want to know what the truth was. I thought I knew what the truth was. You know what the truth was? Everybody told me I didn't matter. That I was this worthless drug addict. I would hear that on one hand, and on the other hand, I would hear, you know what? You're this great guy that plays this music and gets to go and do this and that, and that sure is a nice car you drive, and that's a nice guitar. That's a nice townhouse you live in. I was dead. I had nothing. But I'll never forget this day in my life that I'm about to talk about real quick. July 28th of 1997. I went to church, the very same church that I grew up in, with my mother and my father. I walked up in there, what most people would call an atheist. I walked into that church not believing that there was a God, and if there was one, I really didn't want anything to do with it. I was as hard as you could be. I walked in looking, in some ways, in the back of my mind, for the truth. Because I was to the point, you know what, God, if you're really real, I don't want to do this anymore. I'd just rather die right now. And I walked in and I sat in the very back of the church as far as I could get away from the preacher and the worship team. They played their music, which sounded like people running their fingernails down chalkboard to me. Because I wasn't used to listening to organs and pianos. This was a very traditional church. They didn't do the nice contemporary stuff we heard a moment ago. They were playing the old hymns, which I love the old hymns now. Some of them. But at that time, I was used to very distorted guitars, big drum set, big sound system, and the bass knocking a hole through you. And people jumping up and down and moshing and doing all this stuff. And I sat back there and I said, oh, I have went to hell, and here I am. I guess this is it. And then this man got on stage up there, and he started talking. He locked eyes with me sitting back there. Probably because I was the strangest looking person in the room, I'm sure. He later told me that God told him to preach